Hello, everyone. I am Sebastian, and this is part of the Kenya WSCC series on judge training. What this lecture will be about is a brief discussion on how actor motions work and a related type of motion, those that are phrased as in the interest of function. So obviously, that is me. Hello. And we strongly encourage you to check the judging manual. We put a lot of work on it, and it will definitely clarify many of the questions that you may have, especially about new things that we have clarified about the rules, or maybe new examples or new phrasings that might be helpful. Uh, Surely, there's still a lot that you might get from watching this lecture because I will try to use different illustrations and different examples to maybe clarify some of the concepts that you will find in the manual. So, cool. The structure of the presentation has three parts. Firstly, I will introduce actor motions. Secondly, I will discuss how burdens work in this particular type of motion. And then finally, I will discuss motions that are phrased as in the interest of. So first of all, what are actor motions? So what this motion really require teams to do is to closely examine the perspective of a given entity and argue that from the perspective of that particular entity, something is a good idea or is a bad idea. Obviously, the perspective of this entity is informed by the sets of values and principles and the interests of the actor, and this clearly can differ, and they can differ quite radically from those of the general public. So say we can have an actor that has a very idiosyncratic subset of values or a perspective that's very different from those of the average reasonable voter that you would usually try to impersonate when judging a debate. Clearly, this is to an extent informed by a subset of facts that the actor knows at the time. However, we have to recognize that what subset of information is accessible for a given actor at a time is very speculative, and often it is not very clear how we would litigate disagreements as to, well, what sort of evidence they may have access to or find credible. So whenever these claims about epistemic actors are made, they have to be well justified. Okay, cool. So then, secondly, what we think is crucial to clarify in an actor motion is that the discussion is true-pronged. Why? Because firstly, there is a debate as to whether this fulfills the interests of the actor. And then secondly, there is a debate as to what the interests of the actor are in the first place. And both things are often open for debate. Finally, one thing that's very helpful to clarify is that even though obviously actor motions are framed as X, that doesn't mean that every actor is a uniquely selfish person. So it is not correct to say that an actor motion is the same as this is about what benefits the actor most in an incredibly narrow sense of they get more money, they get more power, they have more influence in society. No. Why? Because it is ultimately a debate about what the actor values. And the subset of things that a person values is much broader than that very crude and selfish way of characterizing self-interest. So, for example, it could be that what an actor values most is the happiness of their children, or say, the development of their country, or the fulfillment of their moral or religious principles, etc. So I think that's a more helpful way of understanding the perspective of the actor, which is it is what's valuable, what's worth doing, what would be a good idea from the perspective of that particular person, and clearly what directly benefits them in a narrowly selfish characterization of benefits them is just one subset of those things that they value. So okay, part number two, what are burdens in actor debates? So in motions in the type this houses X with Y, where Y is an action, what the proposition has to demonstrate is that implementing proposition's version of Y meets the interests of X. And obviously, what the interests of X are definitely up for debate. So, What the opposition has to argue is that implementing proposition's version of y does not meet x interests. Opposition here also has the option to develop a countermodel, as with this house would do x motions. Any model introducing an active debate is reasonable only if it falls within the constraints that are available to the actor, which is actually how most policy motions work. There's some sort of plausible limit as to how much you can fiat. This is similar. So what we can reasonably expect the actor to do is what you can factor into your model or counter model. So example of an actor motion. This is a motion from Macau WSCC. I will read it. You're an athlete who has been identified as having huge potential in your sport. Unfortunately, you're a citizen of a country that cannot afford to provide the training and facilities you would need to achieve your potential. Another country has offered you the training and facilities that could make you an Olympian and potentially an Olympic champion. The only condition is that you must renounce your current citizenship and become a citizen of this new country. This house, as this athlete, would accept the offer and move to the new country. Okay, so this is an actor motion. So how would this play out? In this motion, what teams have to do is to argue from the perspective of the athlete and assess whether accepting the offer best serves the athlete's interests. How could this be modeled? What the proposition might model within reasonable constraints is access to things such as top facilities and stable immigration status, since it seems that it would be unreasonable if this was not part of the offer. So say, if someone made you an offer to be trained as an athlete, but they said, well, but maybe we will expel you in 6 weeks. That doesn't seem to be a reasonable offer. Nobody would take it. It also seems to be quite unrealistic. That's not how athlete offers often work. So many reasons why factoring all of this is actually a reasonable assumption that we can put given the motion. However, they cannot assume, for example, guaranteed gold medals or adaptation to a new culture without justification. Why? Because once again, it does seem that in the real world, these are things that you cannot guarantee. And there is no good reason why we would assume that it would play out in that particular way. Okay, what the opposition might argue is that the athlete's interests are better served by staying, highlighting, for instance, factors such as how they treasure their own identity, how they have community ties that are very strong, and how this might be better for their long-term well-being. And they might suggest that there are alternatives and propose a countermodel, such as, for example, seeking private sponsorship while remaining a citizen of their current country. They might argue, even though opposition explains the actor is more likely to win in a developed country, that they value that less because of the subset of values that are characteristic of the actor. So once again here, we see a repetition of the two-pronged way in which actor motions play out. So one question is, what does the actor value most? And then a second question is, does this particular action or policy fulfill what the actor values most? They might also argue that given a well-justified account of optimism bias, that the actor weighs the prospects of winning a medal, even with lower quality facilities, highly. All of this must stay grounded in what is realistically available to the athletes, respecting the motion's constraints. Okay, so this is just a brief sketch of the whole range of arguments that we might expect in this motion. So, another example, an internal actor. This is a discussion on personal knowledge. This house, as a young smoker, would stop smoking. The opposition might argue that, despite smoking having clear health harms to themselves, the actor values this as less important than the benefit of the smoking of the community that you get from smokers, or the pleasure that you get from nicotine. This may be because the actor values the last 5 or 10 years to their lives much less than their current life, due to a preference for the immediate. And we might say that there's some sort of optimism bias or a hyperbolic discounting, etc. But the point here is we shouldn't assess every year in your life the same, because the point here is that we're not trying to do an objective evaluation as to how to assess, I don't know, quality of life adjusted years, because what we care about is the internal perspective of the actor, and you can plausibly build a case, well, actually this actor doesn't value every year of their life the same. They really value their current years that they can spend having a lot of fun and smoking while they're young. They may further provide reasons as to why the actor would believe in such a way. For example, they can say about the time spent with friends, colleagues, over a smoke break, that they may feel more meaningful over extending lifespan to get uncertain and unknown benefits, leading to a preference for current utility, or narratives that perpetrated by friends and society to live the moment. So the point here is very simple. What we have to talk about is not whether this is a decision that is smart, that we would recommend others to take, whether we think it's a particularly rational choice. All of that could be reasonable questions that the average reasonable voter might ask, but that is different from the internal perspective of the actor, whether this is a plausible and defensible way to act, given their background of values and beliefs. And the question here is that plausible for the average smoker? And it might well be. So it is crucial, I think, to maintain that separation between, say, an objective calculation of utility and what you can characterize from the perspective of the actor is what they would value most. Okay, so finally, part number 3, let's talk about interest of debates. So for example, this is a motion from Vietnam WSCC. This house believes that it is against the interests of organized religion to emphasize strict requirements for personal religious commitments. This motion concerns the interest of an actor rather than requiring teams to argue as the actor. Now, what is the crucial difference here? So they are not requiring you to adopt the internal viewpoint of the actor, or what is their, say, relative subset of values, or what is the sort of factual knowledge that they can reasonably access. Instead, what it is asking you is what are the interests of the actor, so to define what those interests are, and then to weigh whether emphasizing strict practices advances or undermines the sorts of interests. Also, in these types of motions, you don't have fiat power. So what you have to say is, why is it that the way in which the actor will act is a reasonable or the most plausible manifestation of how the actor would act? So in that way, it is different from a policy motion. Okay, so for example, in this example, proposition might argue that demanding practices like Sabbath restrictions, fasting requirements, or sexual prohibitions raise barriers to entry, and that this creates attrition amongst moderates and alienates younger followers. What the opposition can counter is exactly the opposite, that it is precisely the fact that they are strict what allows them to build a community that's closely knit and that creates a distinctive religious identity in ways that strengthens their in-group loyalty. Also, just this is in terms of framing, interest of debates are usually used when describing a group of actors and not just a single actor. Okay, so what we have covered in this brief lecture is, firstly, broadly speaking, what actor motions are. Secondly, how burdens work. And thirdly, how they apply to interest of debates. I hope this was helpful. And if there are any questions, it is very likely that you will immensely benefit from reading the manual. Thanks.